Hello, good afternoon everyone. Welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, well, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, well, you should also be having an amazing day. Okay, behind me is the famous Cheng school, which is actually the oldest Chinese vernacular school in all of Kuala Lumpur. Now, this school was established in 1908, and it was established by prominent members of the Chinese Malaysian community, right? Behind me is actually the school, right? And the intention of these schools was in order to prepare the Chinese diaspora for their so-called return from their exodus after leaving the motherland as a result of being displaced due to the ravaging effects of the Opium War, right? The Chinese diaspora found themselves, strangers in a foreign land and forced to adapt to a very, very strange place. And the early Chinese diaspora in Malaya, back then it was called Malaya, did not regard themselves as people of this land, but rather as temporary transients who would go back to China when things had settled down, right, in China. So that's why they decided to form these schools in order that the children of China would never lose their cultural identity, right? So basically, these schools operate like this. The language, the lingua franca of these schools is Mandarin. And basically they instill in you Chinese values, Chinese customs, Chinese traditions, which is all very well and good, right? However, the fact of the matter is that this was before the establishment of Malaysia as we currently know it, right? And if you were to propose the idea of returning back to the motherland, of repatriating to the motherland to someone from the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia today, they would look at you like you were a madman, right? I mean, sure, they do send their children to these Chinese vernacular schools in order to give them, to get them in touch with their Chinese heritage. But at the same time, the fact of the matter is that we are now Malaysian, and that's why returning to the motherland is therefore a pipe dream. It is a pipe dream simply because after being away from China for well over 100 years, and in my case being a Peranakan, well over 400 years, it's simply a pipe dream for the Chinese diaspora to suddenly return in droves to China, right? Because by this point, after being away from the so-called ancestral land, having no recollection of what it even looks like, having no recollection of where our ancestral graves are, and having no emotional or spiritual connection with the land of China, well, the fact of the matter is that although these schools were originally intended to prepare the Chinese diaspora for their return back to China, the fact of the matter is that after 150 years, you cease to be Chinese in the indigenous sense. And because you now have a Malaysian citizenship and a Malaysian identity, you are now Malaysian, right? So this idea of returning to the motherland is a very idealistic and idea that's steeped in race essentialism. The belief that all races should be separate but equal, right? But by and large, it is an idealistic concept that has no bearing in reality. For you see, there is no connection that most of the Chinese diaspora have to China, since we were not born there, and we were simply put, well, we were basically born in this place, right? So this is the foreword of my my video essay, and in this video essay I'm arguing for the fact that the diaspora is not indigenous to their ancestral land. That is the thesis statement of this video. At the turn of the 19th century, when the death throes of American slavery were beginning to echo as a result of the shift in the mode of production from feudalism to capitalism, the transition from farm to factory thereby rendering slavery a costly venture to maintain, the question arose in the American public as to what should be done with the newly emancipated African American slaves. Opinions varied in that regard as to what should be done with the freed slaves. While some Americans argued that they should be gradually matriculated into mainstream American society, others, on the other hand, argued that non-European people had no place under the umbrella of manifest destiny, and that they should be sent back to where they came from, so to speak. Thus, the American Colonization Society was established in 1817 in order to send the newly emancipated Africans back to Africa. The problem was this: they had no idea where exactly they came from. You see, when their ancestors were kidnapped from Africa by the white man half a century earlier, they were a medley of people from various disparate tribes who spoke different languages, practiced vastly different customs and traditions, and probably had little to no interaction with each other, who may or may not have even hated each other in their own ancestral land. Yet thrust together into the same boat, pardon the pun, under such deplorable conditions, and sent miles and miles away to the alien lands of Europe and America, these people naturally developed a certain sense of solidarity with each other due to shared hardships, a sense of solidarity that would, under any other historical circumstances, be among the unlikeliest of circumstances. Eventually, having had their cultural and linguistic heritage violently stripped away from them, these people would be united under a common tongue, the English language, and there, in America, would emerge an identity known as the Black cultural identity, which is distinct from any culture to be found in Africa. It was decided that the migrants would settle in the region of West Africa, and thus the state of Liberia was established in 1847 under the auspices of the American Colonization Society. To their dismay, the African Americans who returned back to their so-called motherland were not received as long-lost brothers and sisters, but regarded as strangers from a foreign land. While they appeared aesthetically similar to the people of the region, they could not be any more diametrically opposed on the cultural level. Virtually everything about them, from the clothes they wore to the language they spoke and the mannerisms with which they conducted themselves, was alien to the natives of the region. Rather than worshipping the gods of the local people of that region, these people worshipped a strange European god in a strange European tongue that had no relevance to the people of the land. They neither spoke the language of any of the local tribes nor knew which tribe their ancestors even belonged to. While one can most certainly say that the freed slaves were regarded as an anomaly in the eyes of the locals, the contempt was most certainly mutual. While the local African people viewed these people as Western invaders in black skin, these freed slaves in turn viewed the locals as being culturally regressive, backward, and inferior,
as they lacked the so-called Western civilizational values that had been so kindly bestowed upon them by the slave master. Before long, tensions would flare up between the local indigenous people and the freed black slaves, who, in the most tragic irony, would then regard the natives in the same dehumanizing manner as their ancestors had once been regarded by the white man, as savage, subhuman barbarians that needed civilizing. The painful reality these Afro-Saxon settlers realized was that race was only skin deep, that they were not the same as the native indigenous people of the land, and after generations of cultural erasure and forced assimilation into Western society, had become no different mentally from any other white man or white woman in their ways, customs, and mentality. Feeling angry, betrayed, and disillusioned at what they perceived to be a double rejection, one by the white man and one by their own people, the African American settlers soon became the very thing that had oppressed them and would treat the local Africans with almost the same cruelty and malice as the white man had treated their ancestors with. Not only were local tribal people barred from so-called respectable society, they were treated as savages and were also mercilessly exploited by the burgeoning class of the Afro-Saxon bourgeoisie, whose ancestors had been mercilessly exploited by the American slave master. Over the years, Liberia would become a hotbed of conflict and devastation, and the descendants of the people who had once been slaves would in turn end up enslaving others. What began as a beautiful dream for some soon became a nightmare for many. And in fact, it was only in 1904 that local indigenous people of Liberia were granted citizenship and voting rights. This is the tragic story that is a tale as old as time. For as long as there have been diaspora populations, there has always been diaspora aspirations to return to the proverbial motherland. And this is often found or met with disillusionment and disappointment. The diaspora have always towed the line between two worlds and have always tried to reconcile two often diametrically opposed identities, and this can indeed prove a tenuous balancing act. Furthermore, diaspora who have assimilated into their new countries, such as Asian Americans or African Americans, will find little to nothing in common with the average person in their so-called motherland beyond genetic makeup. And if they feel rejected by their host society and at the same time unaccepted by people in the so-called motherland, this can feel like a double betrayal, leading to intense feelings of bitterness and resentment. An African-American comedian once lamented that he was not accepted by people in Africa, and he earnestly wondered why that was the case, considering that he was black, just like the rest of them. This poor man was, of course, laboring under the delusion that people in Africa viewed race in the Western sense, oblivious to the fact that in Africa he was not viewed as black, but simply as an American. The fact that he neither spoke any African languages, nor was he able to identify which tribe he originated in, meant that he was to them no different from any other American. This case is by no means a unique one, as countless members of the diaspora, such as Asian Americans, have attempted to form connections with their ancestral lands, only to end up disappointed and disillusioned to find that they were unable to click with the people of their so-called motherland due to a misguided set of expectations. The Asian Americans, for instance, who have spewed such hateful, angry comments at me for being whitewashed, for not meeting their expectations of what a real Asian person is, presumably someone who fits their East Asian model minority mold, and if he's Chinese, is expected to speak some Chinese language. Well, these Asian Americans do not realize that they themselves would be seen as more westernized than I am in any given Asian society, for they know not the cultural norms with which we operate in our Asian societies. The African Americans who lambast my friend Ken Marx as being too westernized, too whitewashed, because he does not sag his pants or behave like a gangster, will sadly find that they too will be seen as westernized and whitewashed if they were to visit any African country. And of course, Chinese Malaysians who call me a disgraceful banana for my lack of Chinese speaking skills and assimilation into the culture of Southeast Asia, being a Peranakan myself, will also find themselves strangers in a foreign land were they ever to attempt to live in China. For as much as the diaspora attempts to curse and condemn other members of the diaspora for the cardinal sin of turning their back on their ancestral roots, the fact remains that most of these people would never deign to return and live in their so-called ancestral lands. Furthermore, all of us have ancestors in Africa, yet I don't see these Sino-nationalist types who call me a disgraceful, disgusting banana trying to learn any African language, because you see, African culture is irrelevant to them as Chinese culture is irrelevant to me, because I'm Southeast Asian. That's not to say, of course, that the diaspora have no right to migrate back to their ancestral lands. After all, migration is a tale as old as time, and so it would be unfair to label all people who have moved from one region to the next as colonizers, should they genuinely wish to integrate into whatever society they choose to move to. Having said that, however, returning to the motherland may prove to have disastrous and often tragic consequences should the diaspora in question simply be doing so in order to get away from racial discrimination or ethnic persecution. As we have seen in the case of Liberia, what began as a movement of hyphenated Africans from America would turn out to be a nightmare for local populations, who clearly did not welcome the arrival of these westernized African Americans, who, as we have also noted, viewed their indigenous cousins as culturally inferior, backward, heathen savages. The white American people who supported this move back to Africa were, ironically, the very same racists who wanted the black people as far away from whites as possible. Had the United States of America attempted to make amends for its bloody past and offered reparations to the black slaves, rather than dumping them like garbage in a foreign land to wash themselves clean of them, Liberia might never have been established, and its tragic past might well have been avoided. Perhaps the most prominent and controversial case of diaspora repatriation in the modern world, whose impacts are still resonating with the entire world, is the movement of Zionism, or the repatriation of the Jewish people to the so-called Land of Zion, which was supposed to be the promised land to the descendants of Moses after their exodus. Following the mass expulsion of Jewish people from present-day Palestine after the Battle of Masada in 72 AD, the Jewish diaspora found themselves perpetual foreigners wherever they went, and it was in Europe where some of the cruelest and most brutal pogroms were instigated in the name of the Christian religion against the people whom they believed had murdered their favorite Palestinian philosopher. Throughout medieval and modern history, Jewish people in Europe were subjected to some of the vilest and most dehumanizing treatment by people who supposedly worshipped a Middle Eastern Jew. and they were seen not only as shifty Eastern foreigners, but also as easy scapegoats, soft targets whenever anything went wrong. This would culminate in the Holocaust, in which an Austrian man and his anti-Semitic allies would systemically murder 6 million innocent people. It is ironic, however, despite the fact that Arab Muslim countries are not known to be great friends of the Jewish people in this day and age, prior to the creation of Israel, they were far kinder and more compassionate to the Jewish people. While Islamic societies did indeed make Jews pay a jizya, which is an obligatory tax for non-Muslims in Muslim lands, it was no different in principle than a Muslim paying zakat, which is the obligatory amount of money you have to give to charity. And although Muslims sometimes considered Jewish people to be strange and bizarre, violent pogroms, as in Europe, were virtually unheard of in the civilized Muslim lands, and Jewish people who migrated to these places, for the most parts, found safe haven, unlike the Jewish people living in European Christian lands. How ironic indeed that the Palestinians should be made to pay for the crimes of European Christians, when it was in fact the predecessors of the Western leaders who support Israel which were the cruelest and most savage people to the Jewish people. A layman might be forgiven for conflating Zionism with Judaism, since both terms are often used interchangeably by supporters of Israel to label anyone who is against the state of Israel as anti-Semitic. However, while the Jewish religion is 3,000 years old, Zionism, as we currently understand it, is in fact a 19th century philosophy which started out as a thought experiment by secular Jewish intellectuals who were trying to address the question of Jewish persecution. The communist leader Karl Marx's father solved this problem by converting himself and his family to Christianity, while academics like Theodore Herzl, one of the most prominent Zionist leaders, proposed the foundation of a Jewish ethno-state where Jewish people would have self-determination over their own destiny. A few places for the establishment of this state were proposed by the Zionist Congress, among which included Argentina and Uganda. However, Herzl and his followers, for reasons of historical significance, decided on the land then known as Palestine, since that had been their ancestors' historical homeland. It is worth noting that not every Jew is a Zionist, and not every Zionist is a Jew. In fact, Christian Zionism actually predates Jewish Zionism by at least a few hundred years. Some of the most anti-Semitic people in history, like the German preacher Martin Luther, could even be described as Christian Zionists. Luther and his ilk regarded the mass movement of Jews back to Palestine to be a positive phenomenon, as that would not only trigger the Armageddon, but also mean that the Jews would be as far away from them as possible. Like the American slave masters who supported the establishment of Liberia to wash their hands clean of the blacks, many anti-Semites in Europe were delighted to hear of the concept of Zionism, and they supported it with gusto. Zionists such as Lord Balfour and Winston Churchill, for example, were, while not being rabidly hostile to the Jewish people, did regard them with some suspicion, and they, like our esteemed Malaysian minister Mr. Hadi Awang, considered communism to be a secret Jewish conspiracy. Even so, they hated Arabs more than they hated Jews, viewing Arabs as, in Churchill's words, a lower manifestation of Jews. And in order to avoid paying reparations for the historical wrongs the Europeans had done to the Jews, supported Zionism wholeheartedly, knowing full well that this mass exodus of westernized Jews out of Europe would inevitably lead to conflict and bloodshed between them and the local Palestinian people, whose culture, beliefs, and ways of life could not be any more diametrically opposed to the Zionists. It was hoped that by shifting the blame from the Europeans to remove historical resentment for past transgressions, the Arabs who had done nothing to the Jews would be made to bear the label of anti-Semitism, and the Europeans who in a previous era had been persecuting the Jews could then be absolved of paying their blood debt to the Jews, which would then be paid by the innocent people of the Arab world. Furthermore, like the Black Americans of the American Colonization Society, these westernized and Europeanized Jews who were going under the auspices of Western civilization could serve as the West's satellite in the region, to serve her geopolitical interests. As Greeks bearing gifts at the gates of Troy, these Europeanized Jews who established Israel, much like their African-American counterparts who established Liberia, were not seen by local people as long-lost brothers and sisters returning back to their long-lost home, but as colonizers in Middle Eastern skin. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent mass expulsion of nearly 1 million innocent Palestinians in what came to be known as the Nakba to realize their dream of their ethno-state spelled the beginning of the end for any good relations of Jewish people with the Muslim world, and it turned them into puppets for imperialism beholden to the very same people who had persecuted them just a generation earlier. Theodore Herzl was not actually the founder of Israel, since he died in 1904, 44 years before the State of Israel was officially founded. But he is widely regarded as the nation's spiritual founder, and his body was repatriated to Israel, where it is buried in Jerusalem. It was, after all, Mr. Herzl who penned out the foundations of the State of Israel, from which its founding fathers, such as David Ben-Gurion and Ariel Sharon, would draw inspiration. It is important to point out, however, that Herzl, as well as most of his fellow Zionist intellectuals, have been secular Jews with a predominantly Western view of the world. It would not even be a stretch to say that they are viewed as mischievous, westernized deviants by strict Orthodox rabbis who regard the formation of ethno-states to be antithetical to the Jewish identity. It is glaringly obvious in Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State, that it is riddled with Western chauvinism and a deep-seated sense of contempt for non-European people and cultures. Palestine is our ever-memorable historical home, says Herzl. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan of Turkey were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. While it is understandable that Herzl, like the freed black slaves who founded Liberia, saw the world through the eyes of a chauvinistic 19th century European, and he saw himself as a civilized Western man, the obvious contradiction was that he also wanted to identify as an indigenous person in the Middle East. Like the founders of Liberia, the Zionists who founded Israel did not view themselves as long-lost brothers returning to reintegrate into the family, but as honorary whites bestowing European culture and values on the Middle East, who would bring their uncivilized and backward brethren out of the dark ages and into modernity, whether they liked it or not. If the local people would not accept the fruits of Western civilization, the Zionists would feed it to them by force. As Herzl explains, we shall learn from the historic mistakes of others in the same way as we learn from our own. For we are a modern nation and wish to be the most modern nation in the world. Our people who are receiving the new country from the society will also thankfully accept the new constitution it offers them. Should any opposition manifest itself, the society shall suppress it. The society cannot permit the exercise of its functions to be interpreted by short-sighted or ill-disposed individuals. Eventually, ethnic tensions would break out between the Zionist settlers and the local population due to a vastly different set of values, beliefs, and ways of life. It was not helped that the British, after promising both the Jews and the Arabs a state for supporting the war efforts, went back on that promise to the Arabs, instead signing the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was supposed to create a Jewish state with so-called minority rights. The Arabs were understandably furious. They had helped the British just as much as the Jews had, yet the British were now going back on their word and honoring their side of the deal only to the Jews. This perceived favoritism to the Zionist Jews was what soured the relations between Arabs and Jews in the region, who began to view each other with distrust. And this would inevitably lead the founders of Israel to conclude that at the end of the day, they could not live together in peace with such a hostile society whose culture could not be any more diametrically opposed to theirs, and who viewed them not as indigenous people of the land, but as European invaders coming in under the pretext of going back to the motherland. Although Zionists like to describe historical Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land, the inconvenient truth is that there already had been people living on the land for over a millennium, even before the first Zionist settlers in the 19th century set foot on the land. Depending on how far you want to go back, whether you want to go back to the biblical kingdom of King David, or whether you want to talk about the time of Sultan Saladin in the Crusades, the land of Palestine has never been an empty, barren piece of land. The inconvenient truth was that there already were native populations living on the land, who were comprised of both Jewish and Arab peoples who could trace their roots back all the way to the time of the Crusades. Under Ottoman rule, Jewish people were free to return to Palestine at any time they pleased, and in fact, it would not be far-fetched to say that the Jews enjoyed far more civil rights and liberties under Ottoman rule than they ever did under European Christian rule. The founders of Israel were then left with an urgent question: what to do with the native populations? It seemed axiomatic that since they were creating a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, they should simply leave the local Jews alone, even if they considered them to be backward bumpkins. But the majority Arab population, which in their view posed a greater existential threat to the survival of Israel, as for them, the Zionists were left with two options: either convert them to Judaism, which seemed unfeasible considering their commitment to Christianity or Islam, and their distrust and hostility to these newcomers, whom they regarded as European stooges, or expel them. David Ben-Gurion, the future Prime Minister of Israel, finally decided that expelling them would be a more sensible option. After all, it would be extremely difficult to guarantee the loyalty of a population that had been coerced into conversion. And if the Arabs were simply left alone, the Zionists would be sleeping with one eye open, and they would be living in a perpetual state of fear, being surrounded by people they regarded as ticking time bombs. In a 1937 letter to his son, Ben-Gurion wrote, "The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war. the opportunity would finally come in 1948 after Israel's declaration of independence, when several Arab nations declared war on Israel, which, thanks to the support they received from both the United States, which wanted Israel to become their proxy in the Middle East, as well as Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who also wanted Israel to become his proxy in the Middle East, Israel emerged triumphant from the war, and they now had justification to expel vast swaths of the treasonous Arab population in order to seize their houses and farmlands as the victors' spoils. Till today, there are approximately 6 million stateless Palestinian refugees around the world, who are comprised of both the original displaced people of the Nakba, who still hold the keys to their old houses, as well as their descendants who have no means of setting foot in their own ancestral lands that they have memories of, at least the people who were forced out during the Nakba. Yet the tragic irony is that a Jewish person from London or New York could quite easily migrate to those very same lands, even if he or she has never been there before and has no emotional connection to them and no memories of them. What became a beautiful dream for some people, as noted by Dr. Gabor Mate, became a nightmare for many. Okay, now it's time for the conclusion. If we observe the cases of both Liberia and Israel, we can draw several parallels between both countries. Number one, both countries are modern Western creations supposedly meant to address historical wrongs to persecuted populations. Both countries involved the mass movement of a diaspora population back to what was perceived to be the ancestral motherland. Number three, the formation of both countries was not well received by locals and did not come with the consent of the locals. Number four, the founders of Liberia and Israel only had a skin-deep connection with their ancestral heritage. The freed slaves who founded Liberia were culturally Anglo-Saxon, and they had no connection to any tribal African heritage. And the Zionists who founded Israel were by and large secular Jews who did not even believe in God and were no different culturally from any other European. And finally, the formation of these countries was informed by race essentialism rather than out of any great love for the customs and traditions of the motherland. And it came at the local people's expense. While I certainly do not want the listeners of this video essay to assume that I'm saying the diaspora have absolutely no right to live in the land of their ancestors, it must not be done at someone else's expense, and it must certainly only come with the consent of the current inhabitants of that piece of land. It is unfair and unethical, in my view, to impose the diaspora on their ancestral lands without the local people's consent, and to expect the current native inhabitants of those lands to simply accept them because you yourself do not want them. It is unfair and unethical to carve out artificial borders on a piece of land and to kick people out to make room for the so-called original inhabitants of that piece of land who were born overseas, who are coming back after hundreds of years, who have nothing in common culturally with the people of the land, and in fact have far more in common culturally with the Europeans who are sending them away. Unless you are willing to assimilate to the culture and respect the sensibilities of the native people of the land, when I say native, I mean people who were born on the land and have memories of the land, right? Unless you're willing to respect their culture and sensibilities, you are not entitled, in my view, to move back to a country just because your ancestors once lived there thousands of years ago, right? If you should, like some members of the diaspora, actually take it upon yourself to repatriate your so-called ancestral lands, it is imperative that you go there with an open mind and be curious rather than judgmental of the locals and their cultural practices if you find that they are unusual for your own sensibilities, remember, you are going there as a foreigner, not as a native. Your ancestor may have been a native to the land, but you are a foreigner who must earn his or her place among the locals. To do otherwise, as the founders of Liberia or Israel did, in wanting to live apart from the locals rather than with them, like when we take the two-state solution, for instance, which angered the Arabs even more because they considered it an insult that the Zionists did not want to live with them. And you know, that would make you no different from a chauvinistic colonizer. Repatriation to the motherland would not be popular if discrimination against ethnic minorities did not exist in the first place. Liberia exists only because of the unwillingness of white America to integrate their black population into mainstream society, instead passing the baton to native people of West Africa, right? And basically, you know, Zionism exists as a consequence of anti-Semitism. On one hand, the Zionists who wanted to repatriate to Palestine did not do so due to any deep and abiding connection with the Jewish culture and tradition. In fact, most Zionists are secular, but out of a feeling of necessity that the only place they'll be safe in is Palestine. On the other, by displacing and ethnically cleansing the local Arab population with the help of the Western powers, refusing to integrate into Middle Eastern culture, and insisting on having their own exclusive westernized safe space, this in turn makes Israel's case a very difficult one to defend in good conscience. The best solution, in my view, is for the diaspora to cease being diaspora and for the countries they reside in to simply regard them as equal members of society to everyone else. If Black Americans were happy in America, they probably would not pine for some mystical Wakanda to return to. If European Jewish people were happy in Europe, they probably would choose to stay in Europe rather than migrate thousands of miles away to an alien land, you know, which was the land of their ancestors that they have little to no cultural connection to. If all people could live together in harmony, we would not even need nation states in the first place. But the fact remains that having ancestors who once lived in a place certainly does not qualify you as indigenous if you do not have memories or a deep-seated spiritual connection that ties you to a place. Otherwise, we should all be entitled to call ourselves indigenous natives of Africa, since we all have ancestors from that part of the world. Before taking the step to repatriate to the motherland, you should really ask yourself this question. Is it really what I want? Do I want to give up my current identity and assimilate into the identity of the motherland that I may not even be comfortable with and basically start a life that I may not even be prepared for? You know, or is it what I'm doing out of grudging necessity? Am I just going back to the motherland out of grudging necessity because I don't feel welcome in the West despite being culturally Western? Because if that's the reason you're coming back, if that's the only reason you're coming back to escape from Western discrimination, that's not a good enough reason if you still consider yourself culturally Western, you see? Because you will soon find yourself bitter and frustrated with your inability to adapt to the culture and lifestyle. And you'll find yourself very frustrated with the locals because you will not see eye to eye with them. Perhaps it would be better for you to fight for your own emancipation in your own country rather than to impose yourself on the ancestral lands, knowing full well that under a different set of circumstances, you would probably be happier in the West. Because the Wakanda of your imagination is probably just that, a figment of your imagination. Thank you.
So my purpose today is not to say that the diaspora have no right to try and reclaim their cultural heritage, right? I didn't go to a Chinese vernacular school, right? But I understand why the diaspora needs to have something that connects them to their ancient heritage, right? And it's indeed a wonderful thing when people do not forget their roots. However, having said that, I still maintain that just because you happen to speak your ancestral tongue, just because you have knowledge about your ancestral culture, it does not make you indigenous to the land where your ancestors live, right? Because you don't have memories of that land, because you never lived there. And if you were to go back to that land, you would be a foreigner, right? Just like any other foreigner, you would have to earn your place in that land, right? It is not just given to you. Or let me rephrase that. You should not expect to simply be accepted as more native than some natives of that land, right? So, for example, when I say some of the diaspora regard themselves as being more native than a native, what I mean is when you have a chap from London or New York, right, who claims that he is more native than a Palestinian farmer who's been on that land for 10 generations, right? This person from London or New York claims that he's more native to the land simply because he happens to be Hebrew, right? And his ancestors lived on the land during the time of King David, all right? But challenge this person to find his ancestral graves on the land and ask this person what spiritual connection he has to this land, right? Because the fact of the matter is, he never lived on that land. He's not aware of the customs, traditions, and sensibilities of the people of the land, right? And after being away from the land for so long, has developed a new diaspora identity, right? The kingdom of David, even the biblical King David, would find the Israeli identity to be alien, foreign, and he would not be able to relate to it. And ironically, the biblical King David would probably be more comfortable with the traditional Arab Muslim identity than he would with the Israeli identity, which is by all accounts a very, very westernized and artificial creation, very much like gangster rap culture or you know, the so-called AZN identity culture, right? So when I say that the diaspora do not have a right to call themselves like you know, more native than a native, it doesn't mean that they can't live on their so-called ancestral lands. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that they must go back in a spirit of humility. They must humble themselves when they go back to their so-called motherlands, right? And they cannot act culturally superior or culturally arrogant to people who have been living on those lands for the past 5, 6, 10 generations, right? Because you are not more native than a person who has historical memories of that land, right? If you were a chap who was raised in London or New York, right? Accept the fact that you are going back there as a foreigner. Just like if I were to go back to China, I think this temple is over 100 years old. If I were to go back to China, I would also be regarded as a foreigner and I would have to earn my place among the Chinese, right? Accept it. Humble yourself and learn to get along with the current natives of the land. Then perhaps you may well have earned your place as a native. Thank you.